Please welcome the first conversation to the stage. The future is representative with Ertharin Cousin and Dr. Alaa Murabit.
Well, good morning. Oh, that is a sorry little good morning. Good morning. There we go. The Secretary General has given us our marching orders and and provided us with the tone that we should set for the day. So I just want to make sure that you are all awake. We're going to have a conversation this morning, and I'm hoping it'll be a robust dialogue. And, I hope so too. And let's start with just that top line question, Alaa. What is representation? And why should anybody in this room care beyond the fact that we got a whole lot of women in here? Why is it something beyond just the fact that there are a lot of women in here and that we're talking about gender?
Yeah. I think, so for me, representation and inclusion, and I mean, there are a lot of buzzwords we're hearing all the time, especially now, which is both, I think, a good thing and a bad thing, in the sense that, for me, representation means that you actually get to be there at the agenda setting phase. It doesn't mean you go and you have conversations with stakeholders after you've already put together your project or your plan. It means the people most impacted by it, be it women, minorities, et cetera, are the ones who actually get to construct the strategy. And the reason it's important to me, I come from a medical background, so I like data, and it's because it's more successful. Point blank, period. It is more successful. We know that 90% of peace processes fail within 5 years. When women are included at the agenda setting phase, we're looking at 35% higher chances of them lasting 15 years. That's not a small percentage. We know in every conflict, we know in every point of tension, even political tension, when there's a change in social norms, when you have representation at that agenda setting phase, it does transform the conversation. People bring up different things. To add to that, I don't know how many of you wake up and watch the news and get a little depressed. I definitely have been lately. But what I think is so interesting about representation is we don't do it as well as people who, the self-proclaimed kind of liberal progressives. We're not very good at legitimate representation. It's a checkbox exercise for us. Whereas when you look at, the rise in authoritarianism, when you look at the misogynistic language that underpins almost every single global challenge, a lack of representation, exclusion, is actually inherent to their agenda. It's part of the thing that makes them successful. It's this idea of us or them, and we're just not as good at it.
I was reading an article recently where the writer said the difference between diversity and representation is diversity is ensuring we all get invited to the dance. The representation ensuring we all get to party, participate in the party. But very seriously, there's been a lot of talk about representation in Afghanistan recently, with the upcoming elections and the rebuilding of government, and you have many of the men who are participating in the development of the process. He's talking about the responsibility for inclusive representation of women, and not just in the government itself, but in the ministries and in the departments. How do you overcome the challenges of culture and making representation actually effective and impactful of those societies and communities that they actually represent?
So, first off, I notice you got out of, answering this question, so I'm going to toss it back to you. I think it's interesting. I have a pet peeve when people talk about culture as a barrier. Mm-hmm. I do. Because culture is a barrier until it's an economic deal. And then they're sitting there at 3 a.m. eating with their hands on the floor, wearing traditional clothing and saying they have to embrace the local culture to be able to engage locally. Mm-hmm. Culture is a barrier until it is something that is seen as beneficiary to the stakeholder, mm-hmm. right? And we've seen it, in the Libyan peace process, we saw it extensively. Mm-hmm. And so I think the unfortunate reality is it's a lot less, in my opinion, about culture, and it's a lot more about political will.
what are we willing to engage on? What are we willing to say is important to us? Because we've overcome culture for nearly everything we think is beneficial to us and to our bottom line. The inclusion of women and the inclusion of minorities just hasn't been on that list, regardless of how much data we put behind it. And there's been so much collected. It's not a matter of we don't know anymore. It's genuinely, and it sounds very pessimistic, but unfortunately true, we just don't care, I think, enough. What are your thoughts?
I don't want to say simplify, but I think there's one word that describes the challenge that is often culture serves as a code word for, and that's power. And it's about who controls. And so often we use words like there are cultural impediments to full inclusion and participation of those of representative differences, as opposed as a simply an excuse for not wanting to expand and share power in a true way. And that is back to you here. The challenge of the old adage of power seeds nothing without a struggle. We can acknowledge the truth of the fact that power is the real challenge, but how do we overcome that challenge then?
I don't think we overcome. I think we go through. I don't think realistically.
I like that.
So this morning, you guys have marching orders for a revolution. Good morning. Just an easy start for the day. No, I do. I think you have to go through. I think it's fundamental for us to understand. When we talk about women's rights, when we talk about inclusion generally, across all of kind of those superficial, personal marks. The fundamental reality is nobody is going to come and say, "Oh, wait, you'd like my seat? Here you go." And I put myself in that position as well. When I think about something that is particularly when we have been taught for so long that there are so few seats at the top, and that you have to fight tooth and nail to get there. And then once you get there, the vast majority of people I know, male or female, tend to close the door behind them because that's what we've been taught. And I think in order for us to actually change that, we have to recognize that, yes, the people who are sitting at the table need to recognize if the table's bigger, it doesn't mean they lose their seat. It just means they get a bigger piece of a bigger pie. But it also means that some people are going to have to be pretty belligerent and knock down that door and be diplomatic while they're doing it, but say, we're not going to stay outside. This is fundamentally about power. When we talk about rights, when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about representation, the difference between being part of that checkbox is that you show up and you give credibility and power to somebody else by your presence there. And the difference when you are there at the agenda-setting table is you have power and credibility in and of yourself. Those are the two big differences. And in order for us to ascertain real power that isn't superficial, that doesn't change with political whim, that doesn't have the quote unquote backlash, the only way we get to do that is by sitting in those seats and demanding our voices be heard and amplifying one another and recognizing that if we don't have a mass of unique voices in the room that are amplifying each other, one person doesn't unfortunately get to change the status quo. It just doesn't happen.
We've articulated the challenge and the way forward. You're a data person. You've already acknowledged that as a scientist. Give us examples and evidence of who's getting it right. Where's the data show that we are making progress?
You really want to this is just a Debbie Downer conversation at this point. She's like, who's getting it right? And you can just hear the pins drop. So I like to be a bit supportive. I think there are people trying. I don't necessarily think, and this is, depending on the audience, contentious. I don't think a single country is getting inclusion and representation right. I think if they are getting it moderately right on gender, they're not getting it right on minorities. If they're getting it moderately right on minorities, they're not getting it right on immigrants. If they're not, there's, people of disabilities, people of different socioeconomic statuses. Fundamentally, we're very bad at looking at representation as an intersectional reality. We kind of check box and we call it the lowest hanging fruit. So if they say, well, we need more diversity, everyone's like, okay, well, let's get women and let's get people of color and put them on the stage, and that's it. And so I think we're not very good at legitimate representation. And the reason I say that is if you look at the highest levels, and this will be a pretty close to home example, but the Forbes list that came out like 2 weeks ago about the most innovative companies or innovative people, and it was 99 men and 1 woman. And the Forbes people said, well, it's not our fault. We use the metrics of, being a $10 billion company, yada, yada. So if you look at it fundamentally, just the numbers, you take anything subjective out of it, we're not even in the game. We're excluded from even being considered. So I don't necessarily think anyone is doing it doing it right, unfortunately. What I do think we're seeing is that corporations are a lot more nimble than governments. We're seeing a lot of corporations have younger, more inclusive voices. We're seeing them take bigger risks, I think because they've noticed that it has bigger payoffs. So we are seeing corporations do a bit better on this, but in terms of governments, even governments that profess feminist foreign policies are still some of your biggest arms sellers and dealers. So for me, I just don't think you can have both. I think you got to pick one or the other. You're either progressive or you're not.
And I think it's fair to say, or honest to recognize, that corporations get it right faster than governments and are more nimble than governments because there's a recognition of the impact of representative boards, for example, representative teams, and the ability to deliver shareholder value by adequate representation and diversity of thought and representation of us, ultimately customer base. And so there is, some would say, a self-interest by corporation and accountability by customers.
Yeah, there's a collective accountability. So if you don't like what a corporation is doing, you just stop buying from it. If you noticed after the Nike Kaepernick ad, the sales increased significantly, but also some people started burning their merchandise, which I thought was just a not smart personal financial move, but that's another story. Yeah. But it was an example of how robust corporations can be in a social narrative and how immediate the response is. When you're looking at it from a government perspective, governments have to wait until the next election cycle or the next poll comes out. And those are very rarely indicative of something real. They don't get to see the numbers go up and down in terms of whether or not people favor them or think they're effective, or they're going based on, Fox and CNN's very different polls. So the reality is governments have a lot more built-in accountability, almost this immediate accountability that does dictate a bit more their tendency to look into representation and diversity.
But some would say that governments have the ultimate accountability because they can be turned out, that voters can express their concerns about lack of representation through how they cast their vote. But is that a reality?
So I'm the Canadian on stage. I'm going to ask the American how she feels about that.
Well, since in the last election, when you had a woman running for president and 60% of white women voted for Donald Trump, that says a lot about the accountability and the importance of representation to voters here in this country. Does representation require descriptive representation in the fact that it has to be a woman representing me, or as opposed to someone who shares my social or political views? And that is in fact representation, actually, that form of representation reflects more of voter
I love how diplomatic she's trying to
Can
be.
you tell
She's like, listen, and I can't answer this question
yes,
for you
I
the way
can,
you want me
because we are on tape and online, and she said,
I'm Canadian. I can answer this honestly.
You're Canadian. You answer. You don't really think.
I'll answer this honestly.
Yeah.
I think
I have a top secret clearance. I like to keep it.
we've already called for a revolution, so I don't know how much you're gonna. So I think the challenge with government is actually they're not very accountable by nature of the way that we've built up our governments, and this can be in Canada or in the U.S. A large part of what governments, if you look at the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when we look kind of at the traditional nation-state system, governments were responsible for the bulk of what a citizen needed. They were responsible for infrastructure, information. They really did provide a significant amount to the citizen. And so the citizen had a necessary relationship with the government. Fast forward to now, and I mean, you get your information off the internet. And you can get your milk, you can order it off Amazon. And individuals are entirely self-sufficient and self-reliant. And the only thing the government fundamentally, puts a stake on is security and protection. That is the big government. That's our biggest expenditure. That's our biggest, when it comes to almost everything else. Yes, they're relevant, but they're not our immediate stakeholder. We have private schools, we have private prisons, we have private. And so when it comes to things like immigration, when it comes to things that can be securitized, where the government says this is an urgent existential security threat, you have citizens engage a lot more. Mm-hmm. And what the government has been very good in doing in the past, particularly 20 years, and this has been studied extensively, is making a lot more things an existential security threat. Mm-hmm. So it's the war on migrants, and then it's the war on Ebola, which didn't really impact anybody, but we spent an exorbitant amount on it, and everybody got really scared about it. And so you always feel like you need to engage, that you need to be involved with the government in some way. And the way that the government can get, in my view, and what we've seen, especially in the past 2 years through data, is the way the government can really change the conversation is by telling you something else is going to hurt you a lot more. So the government can make a mistake and then literally the next day be like, but guys, there's 2 million people at the border. Mm-hmm. And suddenly everyone forgets that the government broke the law or, was unethical and and this is not unique to the US. This is a political strategy. So it's very easy when you are in charge of dictating the agenda and the response to absolve yourself of real accountability and responsibility. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the checks and balances that have been built into government for so long, as we see them now, I mean, institutions exist, but they just haven't been able to, unfortunately, hold people accountable.
Okay, with that in mind, we have a question from the internet that says, are you optimistic that society will be more representative in a decade? With everything that you've said so far, look forward.
I actually am.
Why?
I am. I think one thing we're beginning to realize a lot more, well, that's kind of a lie. I'm on the fence. I think with everything we've said, we recognize that, when there are times of political and when there's times of conflict, be it political, social, economic, et cetera, there is an opportunity for great social change. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that right now in the United States. We're seeing that around the world. We see that in conflict zones all the time. And I think for me, this is the perfect opportunity to see which way this will go. In the past couple of years, it has gone towards more representation. A lot of women of color, a lot of minorities have said, we are sick and tired of not being heard. We demand change. That's been what we've seen on a social level. In terms of in a policy and institutional level, there has not been as much significant change. And so I think the next couple of years will really tell us which way we're going. Mm-hmm. If institutions and traditional power holders will continue to maintain and hold that power a lot tighter, which is what we've seen, or if a lot of those voices and a lot of that organization will be able to bust through those centuries-old institutions. Mm-hmm. So I'm on the fence.
I could take that in a lot of different ways. But we have another question out here in the audience. There's a microphone right behind you.
Thank you. I'm Canadian too, so I'm very glad to see you here.
Good looking out.
But one thing you didn't touch on that I think is ultimately the most important thing, regardless of women breaking through the barriers, people from different cultures, is governments and corporations and all kinds of institutions do not understand there are families to be supported. So it's still difficult for women to get maternity leave, for men to get paternity leave, for them to get support from their company or their government. And when the child is sick, there is not enough support. So before we even think about pushing through those lines, we have to get those governments and organizations on side about how to support the family.
I think we talk about who's getting it right. The Scandinavian countries. If you look at it to your point, not just Iceland, but the Danes, the Denmark. I would argue that that even I want to say Sweden. They do have the kind of progressive policies that recognize that these are families, and that women need leave, not just women, but men need leave for care of families, as well as the appropriate representation or adequate representation in the business and government sphere.
So there's a study that came out, actually, interestingly enough, about Canada and our policy. We have a 1-year leave that can be split, can be taken fully, et cetera. And what it noticed was women who took a significant amount of leave, who took that full year, actually had much harder career hits down the line, even though it's politically mandated. You're supposed to, you're allowed to, you're encouraged to. And I think I think changing policies is fantastic, but we have to change the culture. We have to change this belief that women are the sole caregivers, right? And we look at it, even if you are working full time, you are still, as a woman, more likely to be doing 70 to 75% of the at-home work, the managerial work. You're working 2.5 jobs, whether you like it or not, right? And I think part of that is a much deeper conversation, not necessarily about family leave, because when we isolate it only to family leave, we're forgetting that about 50% of young women are now choosing, 40 to 50% are choosing not to have kids or to have kids a lot later in life, right? And that does feel exclusionary to them. So I think the conversation has to be, what are we saying about masculinity and femininity? What are we saying about our responsibilities? Why are we not having a conversation about the male responsibility to be the caregiver, to be compassionate, to be engaged with kids? Because that's, I think, when we've seen significant change in the conversation, it is an unfortunate reality, but the US is the perfect example for it. When the conversation about maternity leave has really started to change was when Obama was talking about paternity leave. Because people are like, oh wait, there's an alternative to the woman staying at home? Who would have thought? And so I do think we need to have that conversation together and say, listen, we're not the only option. Being a woman does not automatically make me, the unpaid labor. And if you take it to kind of, I think, the more global reality of unpaid labor in general, the amount of unpaid labor women do around the world in terms of supplying a lot of the food that's on our table, in terms of supplying a lot of the garments we wear. I mean, the amount of unpaid labor women do is incredible. And we have never had an honest conversation about that because it asks us to look at ourselves and how we benefit from this system. So I think it's important to recognize there's unpaid labor all around, and it's such a huge conversation. And it is one of the ways in which women are the most excluded from legitimate economic opportunity and from political opportunity and social opportunity across the board. So I completely agree with you.
Anyone else?
I think we scared them when we told them to revolt.
I'm sorry. I see a couple hands. One right here. Go ahead.
I know you're not going to like what I'm about to say, but as a very senior citizen, I have heard this for countless years. The same thing over and over and over again. So, tell me something new. Tell me something positive. Tell me something that's changing, because what I'm hearing is the same story that I've heard for many years.
I can tell you something new and positive. I don't think you've ever heard this story from a visible Muslim woman and a black woman on stage. So I will be very blunt in saying I think when a conversation about representation is dominated by the people in power, it's irrelevant. And I think for the past 20 to 30 years, a lot of that has been more than 30 years. I mean, we can go as far back as the 50s and 40s. When we talk about representation, it's often the people who already hold some influence and some power, and that's why they were given that platform in the first place. I do think in the past 10, 15, 20 years, what we've seen is a lot of people who did not have traditional platforms leverage new platforms and start saying, we're going to be heard whether you like it or not. And we're seeing a lot of new movements. We're seeing a lot of new engagement. And I was born and raised in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is the middle of the prairies, and could never have imagined seeing somebody who looked like me have any type of platform, let alone the ones I do. Nor do I remember very often seeing people who were not your traditional power holders, and in Saskatoon that was white men, talk about representation. They were the ones who got to have that conversation, which still makes no sense to me, to be honest. And in many parts of the country, that's still true. So I think really who gets to be in the room and who's dictating the terms is fundamentally different. Fundamentally.
And I just build on that to say that this is where that question of intersectionality that you were talking about earlier is so important, because it's not just that you have a Muslim woman and an African-American woman sitting here, but you have a Muslim woman who grew up in Saskatchewan and an African-American woman from North Lawndale, who had the opportunity to go on and become Her Excellency. And that is a change that says that it is not just about having different faces, but having representatives from different and diverse communities as well. And what we're seeing is more of the, as you noted, those a shift in who holds power, and more of what were traditionally or historically the marginalized or the minimalized groups having more of an opportunity to have their voices heard and have an equality of opportunity that didn't exist in the past. And that we looked for a positive. I think we've hit it.
I think we've hit it. I think we've hit it. I will say I wholeheartedly agree with you that even in the 11 years now that I've been doing this, and I'm sure in your career, you've heard this conversation a million times too, right? Oftentimes I'd be the person bringing it up in the room, but I've heard it before. And my biggest worry is we have this opportunity now where we are seeing people of color, we're seeing minorities, we're seeing people who are often put to the sidelines, we're seeing women really take on leadership roles and try to engage with power. And I think my one concern is if we do not start dismantling traditional structures of power, or at least entering those traditional structures of power in a way in which we are leading them, then this conversation will be repeated again in 20 or 30 years anyways. So I have a silver lining, and then I got to bring us all down again.
Right. And the only thing I would add on to that is, going back to another point that you raised earlier, is the responsibility that we all have to continue to pull others along. Exactly. And not just those who look like us and come from our socioeconomic backgrounds, et cetera, so that we continue to broaden that representative group of leaders around all issues, not just political issues. This one was good. As a woman, what form of discrimination are we guilty of towards our own gender as well as other genders?
Oh, where do you want me to start? No, I think it's another one of those realities of the culture we live in. I think a lot of us have internalized misogyny. I think we have been taught by society that women are not as effective, not as capable, not as powerful, not as courageous. And I think that's something that we've seen. An example I can give you is when we've done workshops in conflict zones, and we've had participants from civil society organizations use words that they would describe men and words they would describe women. And brave and courageous, and like all of those went to the man. Powerful, capable. And for the woman, it was compassionate, kind, listener. And I was like, that's interesting, because it didn't matter if it was a male or female putting those papers up. That was just the general consensus. And I think it says a lot about You know, even when I was during the Libyan Revolution, when I saw a young woman who had been sexually assaulted, and she said, no, I don't want to see you. I want to see a male doctor. And when I asked her why, she said, well, because you look like me. What are you going to do? And I thought that was pretty telling, though. But it's and we see it. We saw it with the election. We see it when we're looking at voting for women. We see a sense, even from women, that this person is not capable, that this person is not going to be able to handle the system. That this is so there's a lot of internalized misogyny. I think we'd be foolish to say there isn't. But by the same token, I think women get a lot of flack for like the supposed women not supporting women thing. And it frustrates me because I would not be here if it were not for women. I would not have any type of power if it had not been for women for decades who did the work before me. I didn't wake up one day and be able to come and talk about representation. Women have had to break down those barriers. They've had to work twice as hard. And I think it's something that society tries to use against women. Like, oh, you women are always after each other. I'm like, yeah, but the men are too. There's just so many more of them at the top that we don't even notice it as much. But I mean, look at Congress. Look at I'm sorry, they're not setting a very good example. So I think we get a lot more, we get hit a lot more for it, but we all have internalized, stereotypes. We all walk through the world thinking things of different backgrounds, minorities, etc. And we have to hold ourselves accountable, but we also cannot allow that to dominate the conversation on women's inclusion, because people trying to make it seem like crabs in a bucket is, I think, a very easy way to divide and conquer.
So as we wrap up,
you didn't answer that question.
Yeah, but we need to wrap up. So as we wrap up, there's one question I'd love for you to answer for the audience, and that is, as we as participants in this conversation and moving towards delivering this revolution, what should each woman in this, or each person in this room, see as their opportunity to make a difference in this area, so that when we sit back down here 10 years from now, we're having a different conversation?
I think it fundamentally comes down to when you're in a room asking who's not there. I don't think we all need to be your excellencies or commissioners or ambassadors or presidents or prime ministers to make a difference. If we look at almost every single breaking point in our current social and cultural norms, they happen in the home and they happen in our local communities. So in the spaces you hold power, and each and every single one of us holds power somewhere. It might be our house, it might be our church, our mosque, it might be our local school district, it might be our workplace, but we all hold power somewhere. And in those spaces that you hold power, look around and say, who is missing from this conversation? Who does not have a seat at this table? Who can I include? And who can I leverage my own power and my own credibility and my own network and my own resources to sponsor and support as they engage in power? Because if we're not doing that, then it starts and ends with us, and it's all irrelevant.
Yeah. We're all accountable, and that's the only way we make change. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.